Number 1. Basement. This happened in the fall when my daughter was only 8 years old. It was me, my husband, and daughter, who lived in a relatively big house. We had planned on having a larger family and eventually did, hence why the house was so big. The house also had an unfinished basement. You couldn't enter the basement from inside the house, though. You had to go outside, and there was a door in the back of the house that led to the basement. It wasn't really the best thing for storage or anything like that, because it was susceptible to flooding, so we really didn't do much with it. Shelley, my daughter, would sometimes go down to the basement, though. She considered it like a fort or something like that. We didn't really like this, and we did our best to keep her out of there. But you know how children could be sometimes. If you forbid them to do something, it just makes them want to do it even more. So we would catch her down there sometimes. Oh, and before you worry, there was nothing down there that was dangerous like tools or nails or anything like that. Other than an empty bookshelf, there was nothing down there. One day, while I was fixing lunch, it was summer so school was out, Shelley came running into the house crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me she heard someone talking to her while she was in the basement. The voice told her to get out of the basement or it would kill her. My next-door neighbor Janet was over, so she watched Shelley as I went to see if anyone was in the basement. Looking down in the basement, there was absolutely no one down there. It was empty, and I chalked it up to Shelley's imagination. There was one good benefit, though, to what happened. Shelley was too scared to go down in that basement, and she didn't go down afterward for a very long time. So I put the incident of her hearing the voice out of my head. I had no reason to believe that my daughter was in any danger. This was months after the event. It was fall now, and Shelley was playing with Janet's son, who was around the same age as her. They were friendly, but you know how children can be. Ben knew about what had happened in the summertime, and he began calling Shelley a scaredy cat for what happened. Shelley did what most kids would do in the situation. She told Ben that if he was so brave, that he should go in the basement all by himself. And being a boy, of course, he decided that he would. Now I have to mention that I did not hear this happening as it was going on. This is what the kids told me afterward. If I had heard this going on, I would have definitely put a stop to it right away. Anyway, where I come in, I was doing laundry or something, and I heard a scream coming from down in the basement. Terrified, I stopped what I was doing, ran outside and noticed that the door to the basement was closed, and Ben was pounding on the door, screaming to be let out. I simply turned the doorknob and the door opened normally. He came out and ran past me over to his house. Going over to talk to Janet, Ben told us that he had went down into the basement on a dare. He looked around a little bit until he heard a voice. The voice told him to get out of the basement or it would kill him. According to Ben, he turned around and looked in the direction of the voice. Remember I told you about the shelf? It was like a bookcase sort of thing. He told us that he saw a witch peeking out from behind the shelf. It was an old, scraggly woman, and she was hiding behind the shelf. I have to admit, his description of what he saw was pretty terrifying, but neither Janet nor I actually believed there was a witch behind the bookshelf, of course. We left the kids at her house, with her older daughter who was 16, and we both went over and went down to the basement. We looked behind the shelf, which was about 6 inches away from the wall, and of course didn't see anyone. No human being could fit behind that shelf, unless they were completely emaciated. So Janet and I just chalked it up to our kids' imagination. But we did put a padlock on the basement door, to keep them from going down there anymore. I mean, children do have a tendency to scare themselves a little bit. So within a week later, I was doing some housework when I began hearing some noises coming from the basement. And I was a little confused because There was no reason that any noise should be coming from down there. My husband was home and he heard it too. He grabbed his gun and told me to wait in the house. As I was waiting, I suddenly heard the sound of a woman screaming, and I was very shocked. I wanted to go outside, but I heard my husband yell from outside for me to call the police. So I dropped what I was doing and I did that. When the police got there, I watched as they led this really scraggly woman in handcuffs from my backyard to a police car. I was so confused, until my husband explained to me that the woman was living in the crawl space under our house. The kids must have seen and heard her, and she hid back in the space when we checked the basement out. I had never thought to check the crawl space out because it was boarded off, with just one trap door that was always closed. When I locked the door, she had no way of getting out to the basement. I guess she wanted to go out and get some food or something? I don't know. So when I heard all that noise, it was her trying to find a way out. My husband caught her and held her down, screaming, while the police came. I really didn't want to press charges against a woman who was homeless and just wanting a place to stay. But then again, she did threaten my kid and my neighbor's kid too. But fortunately, she was placed into a psychiatric hospital instead. I don't think she was dangerous, but she was clearly mentally unstable. Number 2. Strange night. I grew up in a very poor and very rural family, but even though my immediate family was pretty rural, it was nothing like Papa and Mama. The parents on my mom's side of the family, they lived pretty much in a cabin or in a shack that only had 2 bedrooms. A lot of grandchildren would visit, and we all slept in their huge feather bed when that happened. The walls were super thin, and there was no insulation in the house, so in the winter it was freezing in every room except the main room, which had a stove. We would cuddle up in the bed, covered with many quilts. Getting to the house was a big journey because they lived out in the hills. You eventually had to get onto a dirt road to get all the way there. But don't get me wrong, I know that I'm sort of making it seem like a bad thing, but we absolutely loved it. They had chickens and things, and Papa was a hunter. It was a really, really nice and exciting time when we spent time out there. Now, I was about 8 years old when I had a strange experience at their home. There were 3 of us girls and some of our cousins who were going to spend some time over at their house. But this was also in the fall, so it was not going to be too hot or too cold there. My parents dropped us off there and didn't remain too long before they left. But we liked it, and we were prepared to have a good time. On the 3rd night that we were there, that was when the strange thing happened. It was nighttime, and we heard all the chickens begin carrying on. That was unusual for that time of day. It was night, and Papa went outside to check on them, to see what was going on. And that was when the dogs began howling too. Well, they were in the backyard also, but they were all leashed to the dog houses. Papa came back in the house, and he was frustrated that all the animals were acting up, and he couldn't get them to quiet down. He grabbed something, and then he went back into the backyard. All of us kids were worked up. Some of us were scared. But one of the boys saw something in the front yard, so he and the other boys ran out into the front yard. Me and the other kids followed shortly after. The driveway to the old shack was pretty long, and what we were seeing was something bright out on the dirt road. We had no idea what it was and thought that it might have been a ghost. But rather than being scared of it, we moved closer and closer to it, and when we got close enough to make it out, it turned out to be a glowing cow. Papa and Mama then came out into the front yard to see what we were doing, and they all saw the glowing cow walking along the dirt road in front of the house. No one got close enough to it to touch it, or interfere with it in any way. We just watched as the glowing cow walked down the road, before we were all hurried back into the house. Now, Papa thought someone was playing a joke on us, by putting some sort of glowing substance on the cow, but that didn't explain why the chickens and the dogs were so worked up. And they stopped being such when the cow was gone. But there were some boys who lived out there in the country who would have done a prank like this if they could have the chance. We never found out. We never had that experience again. We never saw the cow, and no one ever talked about it with us. All of us saw it, though, so we knew that whatever it was definitely real. Number 3. Fortunate Son, a Ghost Story. As early as I can remember, I wanted to be an artist. Friends and family used to say that I had a natural inclination for the arts. I learned that I could see and hear things that others couldn't. Art and music were my great escapes. They were the only activities I was left almost completely alone with. When the adults asked me what we wanted to be when we grew up, I'd answer, an artist. As the years went by, and I learned more and more about myself and the world, the one wish changed into knowing the truth about everything. I had night terrors growing up, and wet the bed until I was 12. It was a constant embarrassment, and the reason for most of the mental, emotional, and physical abuse I endured at home and school, until I finally grew out of it. I never understood that there was much more to life than just humiliation, embarrassment, and punishment. I wanted to see, feel, taste, and hear everything. When I was a boy delivering papers in a small town USA, I had an experience that changed my life forever, and my once contorted view of death, that undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns. My first encounter happened when I was about 12. I was walking my bicycle through the town cemetery to deliver the last Saturday afternoon paper. It was summer vacation, so there was no school until early September, and it was a Saturday afternoon. Indian summer, they used to call it, so the weather was pristine and clear. I had got about halfway through when I heard what sounded like a child crying. After some minutes, feeling, listening, and reading the inscriptions, I happened upon an old, barely legible headstone that contained the remains of a child, a girl, who had died in 1811. She was 7. I stood there in the waning sun, a light breeze welling up from the town below, and suddenly felt this powerful emotion overtake me. I began to cry uncontrollably. I saw her alone, in the dark. I visited her from time to time until we moved. Of course, any idea of going straight home to face another bout of verbal, physical, and emotional abuse from our family, Morgan Le Fay, my mother, was clearly out of the question, because I grew up guilty of a crime committed without having the ability to prove I was innocent, let alone knowing what I was guilty of. I was routinely punished. Sometimes I was even punished for what my brothers and sisters had done. At such times I thought of myself as the whipping boy, or the whipping post, or the scapegoat, or my mother's favorite, the bad seed. My mother was a recovering Catholic and alcoholic. When she was feeling particularly wicked, she blurted out that I was the product of a rape, and thus my guilt could never be pardoned or go unpunished. Along with the bullies at school, the teachers who hated me, and the coaches that would put me on the bench, she'd made certain of that. I enjoyed some semblance of happiness with my art and music, however, thereby making me a target of the small town, small-mind badasses and bullies that existed back then, which made me good at one other thing, unfortunately, and that was fist fights, some even with adults, and running away from home every chance I got. Eventually we moved after 10 years of small-town hell to the big city, where after 5 years of street fighting, petty larceny, drug use, alcohol abuse, shoplifting, and attempted suicide, my life should have been pretty much over. Only my anger, obstinance, recalcitrance, and decade-long fear of death kept me going. Then there was my mother, reminding me over and over about what happened to her father, my grandfather, whom I had never met. He was imprisoned for life, for murder, and died there in 1966. Only depression, dementia, and an early death awaited demon childs like me. I was told repeatedly unless I was rich, lucky, blessed, no chance of that, or very clever. I guess I was lucky enough to have the luck part down pretty good. I never saw or heard any more ghosts during those years, at least not the spectral kind. The abuse at home continued, however, unabated, at least until I moved out of the house. I was 15 the first time. I lived in the hood during those years, where I got to see up close and personal some of the early deaths that awaited boys like me, and for what I could see and hear and even smell, they were nothing like what my mother told me, like the little girl in the cemetery. I felt sorry for them, too. Years later, as a burgeoning graphic artist, I would visit cemeteries. I would collect my charcoals and newsprint and trace trombones, headstones, statues, mausoleums, crypts, sculptures, dedications, etc. They inspired me to new mediums of expression, painting, sculpture, carving, murals, and mosaics. I researched the cemetery's local history, their oldest and their most famous interred. Because of my introduction to violence, depression, and near suicide at an early age, my art evolved into depictions of dark symbols and images of an imagined netherworld, with creeping swaths of pitch black defining the outer edges, while gradually eroding the gradations of light, at once shading and defining a central figure, which would itself gradually recede into the purest white, along with the ancient medieval symbols of purity and corruption. I saw clearly the world and myself in it, and reveled in the corruption on the fringes, just so in my own life at the time, but always ultimately giving way to the light, with the illusion of three-dimensional shadowing and mosaic-like brushstrokes, like the lines on a pen and ink drawing, itself a stylized variation of the old woodcuts of the Middle Ages. The effect gave both a forbidden and magnetic aspect to my art back then. I won a 2-year scholarship to the local art museum. My themes would almost always be represented by the void, or death eventually, ceding to the light or life, revealing a timeless central figure in a post-classic contrast of color, light, shadow, and black, surrounded by hundreds of other, less clearly defined figures, who, because the eye tended to shift towards the light, gradually faded into nothingness, blackness, from which we all succumbed to in the end, or so I thought then. Those that surrounded the central figure were composed of varying human shapes, as one would see in the hundreds of charcoal drawings of a Da Vinci or Botticelli, all caught together in an eternity of imagining who or what the central figure was to them. Their facial expressions showed that for some, their minds had already been made up, while others were still unconvinced. Some of them were touching the central figure, clutching it, cradling it, like a hand on a shoulder, or an arm around a waist, or a boy resting his head on a knee, some looking up expectantly, adoring, loving, hating, defiant, submissive, contemptuous, whatever they or you imagined him, or her, or it to be. Looking back, my fascination with the void, death, was directly influenced by growing up in not just an unhappy home, but a rapidly changing world. The counterculture of the 1960s and the anti-war demonstrations and moratoriums against the Vietnam War, and later the latent counter-revolutionary arrogance of the 60s turning into a let's party by overindulging drugs, sex, and alcohol in the 1970s, all of which played a significant part in my getting straight, and finally seeing clearly the world I came from, and the world I lived in then, and still remember to this day, like looking at someone who was supposed to be you, but never really was. At the time I was exceedingly curious and still too young and ignorant, like so many before and after me, of the self-indulgent depictions of the imaginations of other artists, musicians, performers, writers, actors, producers, and directors at the time. These pseudo-personalities, along with their knowledge of some of the historic mythological characters that we all learned about in school, like Orpheus and Eurydice, Hades and Persephone, Christ and Lucifer, life and death, created in my mind a fantastical perception that I realized too late was meant for those that had already lived and weren't afraid of living in their future like I was. They dramatized death to live, while I was still trying to get as far away from the decadence and tragedies of the living, because I was still convinced there was no future for someone like me. At one of the lowest ebbs of my young adult life, I took a chance and went to a Sicilian fortune teller who, for $20, read my palm and told me that unless I found out why I was treated like a red-headed stepchild, I probably wouldn't live past 40, reinforcing my young, ignorant mind to think, what difference does it make? Or like my mother used to say, whatever happened, you deserved it. She was right, just not for the reasons she thought. Most of the things I saw back then, some even looking like actual people, but felt really bad, inspired much of my work and were incapable of anything, other than appearing now and then, whereas I, the unwitting sacrifice, found myself increasingly drawn to them. I did not doubt that some of them did know life once, but even we who can see can only guess what that life was, or whether even they remember any of it anymore themselves. Early on they'd show themselves from time to time, but it was almost always a prelude to, follow me, I will show you more. The only thing they ever showed me during those years was an early death. They couldn't actually take life, like some possibly did once themselves, if they'd ever lived at all. Some were not ghosts, they were something else. But they were capable of getting to you to do it to yourself, if you were young enough and ignorant enough to keep following wherever they led. I only realized in time, and by the grace of God, that theirs was a vicarious and wicked attempt to somehow experience life by getting the living to give up their own. Because of the violence of my beginnings before birth and after, and quite literally for years, I realized that whether with the living or the dead, I was allowing myself to be used. I experienced personally and spiritually that whether alive or dead, both were being driven by an insatiable lust for life and death. I felt the pull with every abuse at home, and I felt them grow stronger and stronger as I neared my own passing. At first I believed that they were the answer to the pain and anguish I felt for years about myself, and why I was even here, with the living at all. If this was what I had to endure for the rest of my life, I talked to psychiatrists, psychologists, priests, pastors, gurus, rabbis, shamans, teachers, professors, doctors, but none either could or would help. I remember a psychiatrist, referred to by a close gay friend, who himself later committed suicide, say, "I can't help you unless you have either attempted or committed murder or attempted suicide." Of course, I can't help you if your attempted suicide changes to committed suicide. I thought that if that is what passes for professional levity, I didn't need his help after all. For some of the dead, or the lost, like some of the living, it's about the illusion of life, regretting what once was but now is lost, and lusting for a life they have been told is worth living. Both thrive on a pervasive sense of self-pity, as if any of us can yet imagine an eternity without end, or a life never lived. Each thrives on sympathy and empathy. They will follow you, move in, and take residence in your home, or yourself, if you let them. They will drive you into taking your own life, in the vain belief that they will somehow gain a little back for themselves. But in truth, it's their fear of life that keeps them there, stuck between two realities. I met one in a cemetery one hot, late summer afternoon. I was going over some of my drawings and tracings from earlier that day. I closed my eyes for what I thought were seconds, but when I opened them, a man was standing not 3 feet away from me. I never heard him approach, or even sensed that he was there. He was alone, on foot, and formally dressed like a man going to a funeral. He had longish black and gray hair, a beard, and was dressed like a gentleman of the 1800s. He had black eyes, widely spaced as though, while one bore down on you, the other took in whatever was to the side or behind you, like some kind of half-human chameleon, or some otherworldly versions of a Jack Elam or a Marty Feldman. Either way, he was certainly abnormal. He stood there for some moments, looking down at me with his one eye, or was it through me? Then, having said nothing, he just turned and walked down the hill, following the road. For no apparent reason he veered left, off the road, and into the cemetery grounds. After some moments I got up and walked down the hill in the direction he or it had gone. Because of his apparent elderly state, I reasoned that he certainly couldn't have gone far, yet there was no sign of him anywhere. There were no funerals that day. At first I mused they'd probably been hanging out there for decades, harvesting souls for the devil. But I came to believe that the only spook hanging out in the cemetery was me. He or it was probably just passing through like so many others. Of course, some of the others were far clingier and dangerous. As time went by, my chance meeting with the gentleman ghost helped to give me a reason to live. I'd never understood before. It took me years to admit and finally realize that. Though he never spoke a word, his look seemed to say, "What are you doing here? Who are you? You aren't supposed to be here." For me, that meant a long, hard, but eventual escape from what I realized later was a path that led only to an early death and an eternity of sadness and regret because I wasn't supposed to be there. Undaunted, I went on to frequent other cemeteries. Looking for any new inspiration for my art, I told myself. Haunting, sometimes day and night, I imagined I was taking on the appearance of a ghoul. I didn't dig up graves or steal skulls or family heirlooms, anything like that. I just thought that I found what I believe was a far greater sense of peace than rocking on the streets or neighborhoods of my hometown. Out there were crimes, homicides, suicides, madness, and here there was a kind of forbidden beauty and peace everlasting. Or so I thought. My young, tortured mind told me I wanted to live or die in peace, even if for only a little while. Eternity was, as yet, an unknown country. Even a fleeting imaginary peace was better than no peace at all. That was the allure. That was the lie. The restless dead tells the desperate living. That was when I began to believe almost to my own end. The lotus blooms on the corpses of the dead. He was not the only other person I saw then and for years after. I still sometimes see, hear, and feel them today, during times of great stress mostly, or physical or emotional illness. For years I unwittingly let them attach themselves to me. The worst was the first 5 years, from the age of 16 to 21. Gradually I came to understand that this was just not a physical illness, or a mental or an emotional one. It was a spiritual illness, an absence of God illness, where without the light, the things that haunt the dark are far more numerous than we, and would eat us all alive if they could, but the light keeps them at bay, lurking and plotting back in the shadows. What I came to understand was that for me, it would be a lifelong body, mind, and soul rebirth that would and did kill me many times over. Yet death eluded me, and in that time of great suffering, the wicked and the sinful will seek death, but none will find it. Over the years, I learned that death for some was somewhere below life, where tragedy and suffering lay broken in the souls who lingered still, hover in the dark, angry and resentful. The cemetery, from which the things attached themselves to me, took a lot more to get rid of than I was capable, and though I held them back for 5 years, I knew that it would take an act of God. As it turned out, that's exactly what it took. Of course, this didn't mean I didn't attempt suicide. 4 of those 5 years, and 3 more after, because I was still testing over and over if it was real, that I was free of the things, because I actually couldn't believe that I was. It took me many more years beyond the 5 years hauntings to know it was true. I've been celebrating life ever since, but like the saying goes, you save a life is now a part of you for as long as you both shall live. And woe be unto you if you don't leave that life better than you found it. May we all be in heaven half an hour before the devil knows we're dead. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.